Well, Tesla has certainly gone on sale if you think about where it was in terms of price and where it now is. The question is it now more likely to go higher than lower, and is it time to buy the stock? I will walk through the analysis to answer that question, and then of course do my analysis of the overall markets. There's been a lot of turmoil and volatility. I'll give you a sense of where the markets are likely headed, and then we'll look at the trade of the week, a stock that made a massive gain on Friday. That's all coming up in this week's Stockscores Market Minutes. All right, so let's talk about Tesla. Obviously, it has had some crazy volatility over the last 3 or 4 months. If you think about 3 months of downward trending market on Tesla, it lost 50% of its value. But over the past 3 weeks, it's been moving up. And so the question is it time to buy? Well, let's look at the chart. And we're going to start with the daily chart of Tesla. And I can draw a trend line here. Starting at the highs, this is how you draw trend lines. And just let the line fall until it hits what we call inflection points. So these are these peaks. Now it's never going to be exact. Just try to pick the line that best fits as many of those as possible. Now the typical reversal pattern of a downward trend is as follows. Downward move, break of downward trend, build of rising bottom, and then break up from rising bottom. That's the pattern that happens over and over again when stocks are reversing their downward trend. And you can see that that pattern is building here. We've had this rising bottom build, and now this past Friday, the stock is breaking up through resistance from optimism, which is a rising bottom, and that's a pretty good sign that the stock wants to go higher. However, we always want to look at multiple time frames to get a sense of what the longer term picture is. And on this chart, there's one little problem, and that is this upward trend line was broken. That means when that trend line was broken, the chart was broken. When the trend line is broken, that establishes this as resistance. So yes, we are breaking the downward trend line. We're breaking up from a rising bottom, but the upside is going to be limited to this, and it could very well only go up into here and then pull back again. So what you want to watch for is going back to this daily chart. As long as the bottoms are rising as we start to move up here, we're healthy. I think that the stock looks pretty good here for a longer term trade. But if a new upward trend line forms and then that trend line is broken, then we want to cut our out of the stock. One other thing, there is no guarantee that it's going to move up from here. This is just what is likely to happen based on the pattern. I would say 70% chance that the stock moves up from here. That also means 30% chance that it goes down. And so we have to protect ourselves against a loss. And we do that by planning to lose if the stock falls through this floor. Now the floor is at about 270. I think if it starts to dip down through 260, there's a bit of a problem. So that's your risk management. Buying at around 300, support at around 260, you've got about 12% downside if this trade should fail. All right, so that's a quick analysis of Tesla. One other chart we can look at is the intraday chart. I'm jumping to the Stockscores website, and before I show the intraday chart of Tesla, just a reminder that I do a free weekly newsletter. You can register for it there for free at stockscores.com. And of course, you can also find the stock score on any stock. Just punch in the symbol in the top left. So I'm punching in Tesla. And what I want to show you is the short-term chart. This is now the 1 month chart. And here you can see that breakthrough resistance that we saw on the daily from optimism, which is a rising bottom, from low volatility. And as long as we hold above this floor and don't penetrate it, and again, a stop loss at 260 makes sense, I think there's a pretty good chance that the stock will go higher. All right, let's get into this week's market analysis, and we're going to start with the chart of the S&P 500, SPY. And very similar here, we've got a downward trend that was broken. We've built this little rising bottom, and now we're starting to maybe test a break through the rising bottom. So the market looks good, but the volume is very light. And that tells us that the buyer enthusiasm isn't there. Now, why would that be? Well, everyone that follows the market anyway knows that there is still lots of things that can go wrong on the tariff question, on the trade war question, because the US government basically gave the rest of the world 90 days to come up with, some sort of plan to make tariffs more equal. And in the meantime, these tariffs have been held back. But if that doesn't get a good resolution that Trump wants, then we could easily see more tariff talk, more heightened volatility in the market as a result. And that would cause things to go lower. So I think that the market has stabilized and it looks okay. But I think you still want to play individual stocks that have alpha. Now, alpha stocks are those that are trading on their own story. They tend to be lower price stocks. They tend to be characterized by abnormal volume. So if a stock is trading much more volume than normal and able to move up, that is a sign of alpha. That means it can disconnect from what the overall market is doing. And because the overall market still has the potential for some significant weakness, if headlines go the wrong way, then you want to trade stocks that are going to be disconnected from that correlation to the market. Let's take a look at the NASDAQ 100. QQQ is the symbol there. And here we see the downward trend on the daily, building rising bottoms. That's a positive, knocking on the door of resistance. Are we going to get rejected at resistance, or are we going to go sideways and then break out? If we can go sideways and break out, then we should move back to those highs. But if this upward trend line is broken, then we want to be cautious. So that's the sort of game plan. I think you can start to be long of a few stocks, the ones that have good chart patterns, but you still want to be pretty selective in what you buy, because I don't think the market is necessarily out of the woods. Let's take a look at the small cap market. IWM is the symbol. Here is the downward trend line. We are still below it. We are starting to build rising bottoms, but unlike the large cap markets, the small cap market is still below this downward trend line. So in general, I don't think it's a great time to be a buyer of small cap stocks. However, small cap stocks are where you have alpha stocks. Tends to be lower price stocks. So while overall I wouldn't want to be buying small cap stocks, I do think the best opportunities are in those alpha stocks, which will tend to be lower price stocks. Just only those that have alpha, and I'm going to show one at the end of the video to explain what I mean. All right, here's the chart of the TSX, and you can see we've had this great comeback in the Toronto Stock Exchange, coming into resistance here, into resistance here. In other words, upside is limited, lots of volatility, which shows uncertainty. I think it's a market that's probably doesn't have a lot more upside and probably has more downside, but there's no sign of weakness yet. Until we break this upward trend, we can stay relatively optimistic, but just cautious. Let's move along to gold. Now, gold has a chart that has gone parabolic. It broke the parabolic trend. It tried to make a new high this week, but made instead a falling top. I think gold is actually more likely to either go sideways in a pattern like this, or potentially, if it breaks this upward trend line, we could see weakness in gold. So I don't think it's a great time to be a buyer of gold. If you're in it, I think you can hold as long as you don't break through this floor that we set late last week. Let's take a look at oil. Oil has been lagging the other markets, and the reason is simple. Concerns about global trade and tariff wars and that sort of thing has concern about economic slowdown, and you can see the result. Downward trend as long as that conversation has been in the headlines. But looking at the 3-year weekly chart, what we do see is that we have fallen into support where oil should bounce back. So I don't think there's a lot of downside to oil. I just think there's also not a lot of upside. It probably bounces back a little bit, but I think in general you want to be fairly cautious with oil stocks. Let's take a look now at the currencies. The US dollar first, and there you can see the effect of trade wars and tariffs on the US dollar. It has been moving lower. If we look at the 3-year weekly chart, you can see that we have fallen into support, so we should hold here. We're bouncing off of it, but until we break the downward trend line, I would be fairly cautious with the US dollar as well. In other words, it's sort of neutral here, but it doesn't have a great looking chart by any means. But Bitcoin has a pretty good chart the last little while. We've been moving up. Here it was. Downward trend line was broken. We built a little rising bottom. We broke up from a rising bottom, and we're now moving up, probably going to get stuck at that resistance level. If we look at the 3-year weekly chart, you can see that we've got this upward trend line. We've held that, hit it once, twice, 3 times. We should get back to these highs, get stuck. Maybe we'll break through, but in the meantime, probably not, probably get stuck there. And as long as the trend is up, that's good. I would not be a buyer here. The opportunity buy was 2 or 3 weeks ago, and now it's just a hold. Finally, let's take a look at the bond market. TLT is the chart, and this is a choppy sideways trade over the last 4 or 5 months. If we look on the 3-year weekly chart, we can see that the bias is still down. In other words, interest rates still high and not looking like they're going to go lower anytime soon. We have this descending triangle pattern, and if we were to break down through this, that would be a big negative. Now, if we can build a rising bottom, if we can break the downward trend line, hey, then the picture changes, but that hasn't happened yet. And so right now it's still a pessimistic chart, but generally sideways for the last year, and therefore sort of more or less neutral in that time frame. So let's take a look at my ratings then. Neutral, a lot of neutral on this graph this week. The only area where we're not neutral on stock markets is the long-term chart of US small cap stocks. We're still in that downward trend, but neutral everywhere else. Bitcoin, yes, bullish on both time frames. I've lowered my rating to neutral on gold because it does look a little toppy, and I think we need to be cautious and maybe take some profits in the gold market. All right, let's take a look now at the trade of the week. This is a stock that was red hot on Friday and right into the after-hours session. This is NXTT, and what we look for is, first of all, signs of alpha. We talked about that earlier, but you can see the abnormal volume here. Now, this is a very short-term chart. This is for day trading, but coming into the open on Friday, the stock was really just dead, not doing anything. Then it starts to trigger action candles. Action candles are my indicator that looks for statistically significant abnormal price and volume. And when you break from low volatility with an action candle, like right there, that's your first buy signal. Then we build a rising bottom. So now we've got optimism, and we make a new action candle right there. That's great. Now notice price runs away from the trend line. If I drew a line like this, that's our trend line. We ran away from the trend line, which means we're likely to come back to it. Great. That's another opportunity. When you pull back to the trend line and then break the pullback at that blue dot there, which is another one of my indicators, then you get this nice break to the upside from there. So if you're a day trader, there were 2 or 3 great day trade setups on NXTT, a stock that made considerable gains on Friday. You don't have to know anything about what they do. You just trust that the market knows best, and you follow what the market tells you to do. I hope you've enjoyed this week's Market Minutes. If so, please subscribe to the channel. Look at the comments there. Leave one if you think that there's something to be said. And most importantly, trade well.